I am Calvin, 63 years old, and I just watched my son allow his wife to humiliate the woman who gave him life. We were sitting at a table in a five-star restaurant on Mother's Day. When the waiter approached to ask about the check, my daughter-in-law pointed her finger right at my wife and loudly declared that they were not paying for her. She told the waiter to put the old lady on a separate check. My son did absolutely nothing. He just sipped his overpriced cocktail and nodded. I did not raise my voice. I did not cause a scene or flip the table. I simply kept chewing my food. But by the time I swallowed that bite of steak, I had already initiated a mental sequence of events that would strip them of their home, their cars, and their entirely fake livelihood. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their privileged existence, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe disrespecting a mother should come with absolute and uncompromising consequences. Growing up, I learned the value of $1 the hard way. I built a heavy machinery leasing company from the ground up, starting with a single rusted backhoe and a mountain of debt. My hands still carry the scars from those early years when I was turning wrenches in the freezing rain just to keep the equipment running. My wife Diane was right there beside me. For 38 years, she has been my rock. She worked double shifts as a nurse early in our marriage so we could afford to keep the lights on while the business was bleeding cash. She sacrificed her youth, her sleep, and her peace of mind to ensure our family survived. More importantly, she poured every ounce of her soul into raising our only son, Tyler. She was the kind of mother who would go without a winter coat so Tyler could have the expensive baseball cleats he wanted. Now Tyler is 34 years old. He sits across from me wearing a tailored suit that he did not pay for. He runs a tech startup that produces absolutely nothing of value. It is essentially a hobby funded entirely by my corporate accounts. I allowed it because Diane asked me to give him a chance to find his own path. I gave him a platinum corporate card linked to my holding company with the strict understanding that it was for business expenses. Instead, he has been using it to fund an illusion of immense wealth for himself and his wife Harper. Harper is a woman whose arrogance is only matched by her sense of entitlement. She comes from a family that looks rich on paper but is drowning in debt. She married Tyler assuming he was the sole heir to a massive fortune, and she treats my money like it is her personal birthright. I have watched her for 3 years, constantly making passive-aggressive comments about Diane. She criticizes the way my wife dresses. She mocks our modest suburban home, and she acts as if spending time with the people who bankroll her entire lifestyle is a massive burden. I tolerated it only for Diane because my wife desperately wanted a relationship with her son. That brings us to El Aura. It is a ridiculously overpriced downtown steakhouse, the kind of place with velvet ropes outside and menus that do not list the prices. Tyler had actually invited us out for Mother's Day. He called Diane earlier in the week and told her he wanted to treat her to a special dinner to show his appreciation. Diane was so excited she spent an hour doing her hair and wore the pearl necklace I bought her for our 30th anniversary. She just wanted a nice evening with her boy. The dinner started off tense. Harper complained about the seating, about the temperature in the room, and about the vintage of the wine. She ordered the most expensive items on the menu, including a towering seafood appetizer that she barely touched. Tyler just sat there agreeing with every complaint she made, desperate to keep her happy. Diane tried her best to steer the conversation toward pleasant topics, asking Tyler about his business and asking Harper about her recent vacation to Aspen. A vacation I later discovered was paid for entirely with my company funds. Harper gave short, dismissive answers, rolling her eyes and checking her phone constantly. Then came the moment that changed everything. The waiter, a polite young man in a crisp white apron, approached our table and cleared his throat. He looked at Tyler, who had made the reservation, and politely asked if the bill would be together or separate. Before Tyler could even open his mouth, Harper dropped her phone on the table. She sneered, looking directly at Diane with a completely chilling expression. She raised her hand, extended a perfectly manicured finger, and pointed it right at my wife. "We are not paying for her," Harper declared, her voice loud enough to carry to the neighboring tables. Put the old lady on a separate check. The silence that fell over our table was deafening. Even the waiter looked completely stunned, shifting his weight uncomfortably and holding his pen frozen over his notepad. I slowly turned my gaze to my son. This was the moment for him to be a man. This was the moment for him to tell his wife to lower her voice, to apologize to his mother, and to hand the waiter his card. I waited for him to defend the woman who had rocked him to sleep when he had a fever, the woman who had given him everything. Tyler looked at his mother. Then he looked at Harper. He swallowed hard, reached out, and picked up his glass. He took a slow sip of his $40 craft cocktail and gave a slight cowardly nod to the waiter, confirming his wife's demand. I looked at Diane. Her face had completely crumpled. The light in her eyes, the joy of Mother's Day, the hope of a relationship with her son, it all just died in an instant. She looked down at her plate, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, as she tried to fight back the tears of pure humiliation. She had been reduced to a burden, an unwanted guest at her own celebration, forced to endure public embarrassment by a woman who produced nothing and consumed everything. I did not yell. I did not stand up and cause a scene. Decades in the cutthroat business of heavy machinery taught me that anger is a useless emotion if it is not channeled into immediate calculated action. Screaming at them would only give Harper the satisfaction of calling me crazy and playing the victim. So I did the absolute last thing they expected. I picked up my fork, sliced off a piece of my steak, and took a bite. I chewed slowly, savoring the expensive cut of meat. I looked Harper dead in the eyes, and I swallowed. She gave a triumphant little smirk, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. She thought she had won. She thought my silence was an admission of defeat, a sign that I was too old and too tired to fight back. She assumed that she had established dominance over the family hierarchy right there in the middle of the restaurant. What Harper did not realize was that my silence was not submission. It was a cold, clinical calculation. In the span of 30 seconds, my brain had shifted gears entirely. I was no longer a disappointed father dealing with a rebellious son. I was a chief executive officer looking at a toxic, deeply compromised asset. And in my business, when an asset becomes a liability, you do not argue with it. You liquidate it. I sat there doing the math. I mentally tallied up the corporate platinum cards, the supplemental accounts, the business lease for his fake startup, and the private mortgage I held on their $1 million suburban home. They were living entirely inside a financial fortress that I had built, and I held the only key. By refusing to pay for a single meal for my wife, they had just signed the death warrant for their entire privileged existence. I wiped my mouth with my linen napkin and placed it neatly on the table. I looked at Diane, giving her a reassuring nod, telling her silently that I had everything under control. I told the table I needed to use the restroom. I pushed my chair back and walked away, leaving them to their smug victory. But as I walked past the bar, pulling my phone from my suit pocket, the era of their entitlement was officially over. I was about to make a phone call that would turn their luxurious evening into an absolute nightmare. I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back against the thick carpet of the restaurant. I did not look at my son or his wife. I simply told them I would be right back. The walk to the restroom felt completely different from any walk I had taken in my life. The ambient noise of clinking silverware and soft jazz music faded into the background. My mind was operating with the cold precision of a heavy-duty engine. Every step I took away from that table was a step away from 34 years of blind paternal grace. The men's room was empty. It smelled of expensive cedar cologne and polished marble. I walked past the pristine sinks and locked the heavy wooden door behind me, ensuring absolute privacy. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my phone. Before I dialed the number, I looked at the dark screen. I thought about the 3 long years I had wasted trying to buy my son's maturity. 3 years ago, Tyler came to my office with a flashy business proposal. He wanted to launch a logistics software company that he claimed would revolutionize the shipping industry. He brought colorful charts and unrealistic financial projections and delivered an arrogant speech about finally stepping out of my shadow. Diane, my beautiful, forgiving wife, had begged me to support him. She asked me to give him the seed money he needed to prove himself. Because I loved my wife more than anything, I agreed. But I did not just hand him a blank check. I set up a separate corporate entity and issued him a platinum corporate card linked directly to my primary holding company. The rules I laid out were crystal clear. The card was strictly for server space, office supplies, legitimate business travel, and paying his small staff. It was meant to be the temporary lifeline for his supposed empire until he secured real investors. But I am not a foolish man. I built my massive fortune by monitoring every single penny that leaves my accounts. For the first few months, the charges were normal and boring. Then Harper entered the picture. They got married, and suddenly the business travel was no longer to cheap motels near tech conferences in San Jose. The charges shifted to luxury resorts in Cabo San Lucas and exclusive ski chalets in Aspen. The office supply expenses morphed into exorbitant charges at designer boutiques for handbags and shoes. I watched silently month after month as my heavy machinery company effectively subsidized a life of extreme leisure for a woman who openly despised my wife. I did not confront them immediately. Instead, I had my independent team of auditors flag every suspicious transaction. They compiled a financial dossier thick enough to bury Tyler in federal court. He was not building a software company at all. He was running a highly illegal personal slush fund, using my life's work as his personal piggy bank. I let it slide for 3 years because I was waiting for him to wake up. I was waiting for the boy I raised to realize that his greedy wife was turning him into a parasite. Today, at that dinner table, watching him silently agree to humiliate his own mother, I realized the son I raised was already dead and gone. I unlocked my phone and dialed the private direct number of my lead attorney and wealth manager, Warren. Warren is a man who does not ask unnecessary questions. He executes financial orders with lethal efficiency. He answered on the second ring. I did not bother with any pleasantries or small talk. I told Warren to initiate the purge immediately. I instructed him to access the holding company accounts right then and there and cancel every single supplemental card attached to Tyler's name. I told him to freeze the routing numbers, to block any pending wire transfers, and to permanently lock down the commercial lease for Tyler's office space downtown. But I knew I could not stop there. The corporate card was just their daily spending money. I needed to strike at the very foundation of their arrogance. When Tyler and Harper got married, they demanded a house they could never actually afford. They found a sprawling $1 million property in a gated suburban neighborhood with a homeowners association they had no business joining. No traditional bank would ever approve a jumbo mortgage for a man with zero actual income and a failing fake startup. So my private equity firm underwrote the loan. I personally held the mortgage. And written deep into the dense legal contract was a strict acceleration and default clause based on financial compliance. Tyler had already missed his last 4 payments, claiming the software market was going through a rough patch. I had given him extensions out of pity. I told Warren to revoke those extensions and trigger the default clause immediately. I wanted the paperwork filed before the courthouse opened on Monday. By tomorrow afternoon, a process server would be standing on their pristine front porch, handing Harper a legal foreclosure notice in front of all her wealthy neighbors. Warren simply confirmed the orders, repeating them back to me with cold accuracy, and hung up. The entire phone call took less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes to completely dismantle a life of extreme luxury that took 3 years to falsely build. I slid the phone back into my jacket pocket, feeling a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I walked over to the marble sink and turned on the heavy brass faucet. The water flowed out ice cold. I washed my hands meticulously, watching the expensive soap lather and rinse away down the silver drain. I felt incredibly calm and centered. There was no sadness left in my chest whatsoever. There was absolutely no hesitation and no guilt. I looked up and met my own eyes in the wide mirror above the sink. I straightened my tie, smoothing out the silk fabric with deliberate movements. The man looking back at me was no longer a forgiving father trying to gently guide a misguided boy. That familial relationship died the exact second Tyler nodded his head at the waiter. I was now a chief executive officer taking decisive, ruthless action to liquidate a deeply toxic financial asset. I turned off the water and dried my hands on a thick white linen towel, tossing it into the wicker basket. I unlocked the heavy restroom door and stepped back out into the bustling dining room. The ambient lighting of the restaurant felt sharper to me now. The path back to my table was perfectly clear. I could see Tyler leaning back in his chair, looking completely relaxed and satisfied, while Harper tapped away on her smartphone, likely booking another expensive spa day on what she thought was my dime. Diane was still looking down at the table, her posture defeated and her spirit crushed. I walked toward them with a steady, measured pace, betraying no emotion. I timed my return perfectly. As I approached the edge of our booth, I saw Gabriel, the general manager of the restaurant, walking briskly across the dining room floor from the opposite direction. He was carrying a sleek black leather checkbook in his right hand. The timing was absolutely impeccable. The financial trap had been meticulously set, the execution was fully in motion, and the first heavy domino was about to fall right onto their expensive dinner plates. I returned to our booth feeling a profound sense of clarity. The dining room of the restaurant was buzzing with the quiet hum of wealth and privilege, but our table felt like an isolated island of tension. Diane was still staring at her lap, her untouched sea bass growing cold on the expensive porcelain plate. Tyler and Harper were leaning in close to each other, whispering and laughing. They probably thought they had broken my spirit. They thought my trip to the restroom was a retreat, a moment for an old man to go lick his wounds. They had no idea I had just detonated a massive financial bomb under their entire life. I slid into the leather booth next to my wife and placed my hand gently over hers. Her skin was cold. I gave her fingers a reassuring squeeze, letting her know without words that the era of our suffering was officially over. Just as I settled in Gabriel, the restaurant manager approached our table. Gabriel was a highly polished professional who prided himself on absolute discretion and flawless service. He carried a sleek black leather checkbook, holding the financial damage of Harper's gluttony. He placed it gently in the center of the table right between Tyler and me. I did not even look at the itemized receipt. I already knew it was an astronomical number fueled by imported seafood and ridiculously overpriced cocktails. I slowly reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my leather wallet. I bypassed the black credit cards and withdrew 2 crisp $100 bills. I leaned forward and placed the cash deliberately on top of the leather folio. I looked Gabriel in the eye and told him softly but firmly that this cash was to cover the meal and a generous tip for my wife and myself alone. Tyler let out a loud, arrogant scoff. He shook his head, leaning back in his chair with a look of absolute pity on his face. He actually thought my cash payment was a sign of weakness. He thought I was throwing a petty little tantrum because my feelings were hurt. He reached into his designer suit jacket and pulled out the heavy metal platinum corporate card I had issued to him 3 years ago. The card that said Vanguard Heavy Machinery right beneath his printed name. He tossed it onto the table with a loud clatter. The heavy titanium smacked against the wood, a sound meant to display his absolute power and dominance over the situation. He told Gabriel to put the rest of the garbage on his card and to bring them the dessert menu immediately. Gabriel nodded politely, picking up the leather folio with my cash and the metal card. He turned on his heel and walked gracefully toward the back office where the main payment terminals were kept. I watched Gabriel walk away, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. I knew exactly what Gabriel was about to experience. He would swipe that heavy metal card through his terminal, expecting an instant approval for the massive balance. Instead, his screen would immediately flash red. An error code would pop up. It is a highly specific banking code reserved for severe fraud and unauthorized access. It is not a simple decline for insufficient funds. It is a direct mandate from the issuing bank telling the merchant that the person holding this card is committing a financial crime. The moment Gabriel was out of earshot, Harper let out a cruel little laugh. She picked up her water glass and took a sip, looking at Diane with pure malice. She leaned forward, her expensive diamond earrings catching the dim restaurant light. She started talking loudly about a luxury vacation they were planning to the Amalfi Coast next month. She looked right at Diane and smiled that same chilling smile she used earlier. She said it was a real shame we were too old and tired to enjoy such long international flights. She was twisting the knife, trying to make my wife feel small and insignificant. Tyler laughed along, taking another sip of his expensive drink. He added that his software startup was about to secure a massive round of angel funding and that he would be buying a brand new Porsche by the end of the month. It was a pathetic display of imaginary wealth. They were putting on a show, trying to rub their fake success in my face. I just sat there listening to their delusions. Every word they spoke was another shovel of dirt out of their own graves. I knew exactly what was happening in the back office. Cutting a standard plastic credit card is easy, but the platinum card I gave Tyler was solid titanium. It weighed heavy in the hand, a physical manifestation of my corporate power. Gabriel could not just snap it with his fingers or use a regular pair of desk scissors. He had to go into the back office, find the heavy-duty metal shears, and physically destroy the asset. The fact that it was taking Gabriel this long meant he had already called the merchant service line and verified the fraud alert. 3 minutes passed. 3 minutes of Harper gloating and Tyler pretending to be a titan of industry. Then I saw Gabriel emerge from the dark hallway. His stride was completely different now. He was not walking with the smooth, relaxed glide of a hospitality manager bringing a receipt for a signature. His shoulders were rigid. His face was completely devoid of the polite customer service smile he wore earlier. He was walking with absolute purpose, and he was flanked by a very large man in a dark suit who looked exactly like the restaurant's head of security. Gabriel arrived at our table. He did not bring the leather checkbook. He did not bring a receipt for Tyler to sign. He did not bring the dessert menu Harper had demanded. He simply extended his hand and placed 2 objects right on the white tablecloth in front of my son. It was the platinum corporate card, but it was no longer a symbol of limitless wealth. It had been brutally severed right down the middle. The 2 jagged halves of the heavy metal card sat there reflecting the light of the chandelier overhead. The arrogant smirk vanished from Tyler's face instantly. His jaw practically unhinged. The confident posture he held just moments ago completely collapsed. He stared at the broken pieces of metal as if he were looking at a ghost. Harper stopped talking mid-sentence, her mouth hanging slightly open in total confusion. She looked from the broken card to Gabriel and then finally to Tyler. Gabriel stood incredibly straight. He did not lower his voice to spare their feelings. He spoke clearly and deliberately, ensuring that the neighboring tables could hear the consequences of their actions. He looked directly at Tyler and delivered the sentence that would end their world. "Sir, your father has paid for his wife," Gabriel stated, his voice ringing like a bell of absolute doom. "But the bank just flagged this card for unauthorized use. They have permanently deactivated the account and instructed me to confiscate the plastic immediately. Your remaining balance for this table is $940. The words hung in the air like thick, choking smoke. $940. That was the exact cost of Harper's imported oysters, her multiple craft cocktails, the massive tomahawk steak Tyler ordered, and the sheer arrogance of their existence. I watched the blood completely drain from Tyler's face. He went from a flushed, confident pink to a sickly, deathly pale in less than 2 seconds. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. His brain was desperately trying to process the absolute impossibility of the situation. The magic plastic shield that had protected him from reality for 3 long years had just been shattered into a million pieces. Harper looked like she had just been physically struck by a heavy machine. Her eyes darted wildly around the restaurant, suddenly hyper-aware of the wealthy people at the next table who had stopped eating to watch the spectacle unfold. She grabbed Tyler's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. She frantically whispered at him, asking what was happening and demanding that he fix it right now. but Tyler could not fix it. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew the card was tied directly to my holding company, and he knew the only person on Earth who could authorize a permanent deactivation and confiscation was sitting right across from him, calmly breathing the conditioned air. He slowly raised his eyes from the severed card and looked at me. I did not look angry. I did not look triumphant. I looked absolutely nothing. I gave him the same cold, emotionless stare I would give a bankrupt vendor who failed to deliver on a contract. They were now completely trapped in a luxury restaurant with a massive unpayable bill staring down a stern manager who was backed by heavy security. They had zero personal funds, zero emergency savings, and absolutely no safety net to catch them. The free ride was officially over, and the massive check had finally come due. The silence that fell over the table after Gabriel announced the massive balance was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a terrible car crash before anyone starts screaming. I sat perfectly still, watching the reality of the situation crash into Harper's thick skull. For 3 years, she had lived under the delusion that she was a queen, untouchable, and infinitely wealthy. She had spent the entire evening treating the restaurant staff like peasants and treating my wife like an unwanted stray dog because she believed she held all the power. Now the magical plastic shield that funded her arrogance was dead, and she was staring down a $940 bill with absolutely no safety net. Panic is a fascinating thing to observe in a person who has never faced a real consequence in her life. Her perfectly powdered face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered terror. She let out a sharp, frantic gasp and immediately lunged for her oversized Prada handbag. I recognized that bag. It was a limited edition piece that cost at least $3,000. I knew exactly how much it cost because she bought it using my company money during one of their fake business trips. Now she was digging through that expensive Italian leather bag like a starving animal desperately searching for scraps. She pulled out a thick designer wallet, and her hands were shaking so violently she could barely open the clasp. She frantically produced a shiny personal credit card and shoved it toward Gabriel without even looking up at him. She ordered him to run it, her voice tight and breathless. Gabriel did not walk away to the back office this time. He was fully prepared for this exact scenario. He smoothly pulled a small black wireless payment terminal from his apron. He took her card with complete professional detachment and slid it through the machine. A short, sharp beep echoed over the table. Gabriel looked down at the digital screen and calmly stated that the card had been declined. Harper's eyes went wide with disbelief. She snatched the card back and immediately shoved another one toward him. This one was a flashy high-interest rewards card. Gabriel slid it again. The machine processed for 2 seconds before emitting the exact same sharp beep. Gabriel did not even blink. He politely informed her that the second card was also declined. Harper was practically hyperventilating at this point. She dug her manicured nails deep into her leather wallet and pulled out a third card. I knew for a fact this was a bottom-tier emergency credit card with a predatory interest rate. She shoved it at Gabriel, her voice cracking as she begged him to just try it one more time. The terminal beeped for the third time. Gabriel looked down at her with eyes that offered absolutely zero sympathy. He informed her in a clear voice that all 3 personal cards were completely maxed out and rejected by the issuing banks. Their personal finances were an absolute black hole. Behind the designer clothes and the luxury cars, they had absolutely nothing of their own. Tyler realized in that exact moment that his wife could not save him. The reality of his situation was finally closing in on him. The wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables had completely stopped eating. They were openly staring, watching the young, arrogant tech executive completely unravel in the middle of a fine dining establishment. Tyler knew that if they could not produce a valid payment, Gabriel would have no choice but to involve the police. Tyler turned his attention to me. The absolute panic in his chest quickly mutated into furious entitlement. He leaned aggressively across the table, his expensive suit wrinkling against the wood. He hissed at me, his voice trembling, with a mixture of fear and pure rage. He demanded that I open my wallet and pay the bill right that second. He actually gritted his teeth and aggressively reminded me that I was his father. He tried to weaponize our biological bond to force my compliance. He thought the public pressure, the whispering crowd, and the shame of a police scene would force me to surrender and rescue him like I always did. He severely miscalculated my resolve. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or offer a single excuse or explanation. I simply pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up from the table. I walked slowly around the edge of the booth and extended my hand to Diane. She took it, her fingers still trembling slightly from the emotional whiplash of the evening. I gently helped my wife out of the leather booth and carefully draped her elegant winter coat over her shoulders. I treated her with the utmost respect and tender care, completely ignoring the two panicking adults sitting just inches away from us. Once Diane was secure and ready to leave, I turned back to look down at my son. He was staring up at me with wide, desperate eyes, practically begging me to fold. I kept my voice incredibly calm and low, ensuring that only he could hear the absolute finality in my tone. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him that I am responsible for my wife. Then I slowly shifted my gaze to Harper, who was still clutching her useless stack of maxed-out credit cards. I looked back at Tyler and told him that he is responsible for his wife. I did not wait for his response. I did not wait for another outburst or another plea. I placed my hand gently on the small of Diane's back, and we turned around. We walked right past Gabriel, we walked right past the whispering wealthy patrons, and we walked out the heavy glass front doors of the restaurant, leaving them completely abandoned. The night air outside was cool and crisp. Taking that first breath outside the restaurant felt like tasting absolute freedom. I did not immediately walk toward the valet stand to retrieve my car. I stopped on the concrete sidewalk and turned around to look back through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the dining room. I wanted to witness the exact moment the entitlement was physically stripped from his body. Through the thick glass, I saw Gabriel give a very subtle nod to someone off in the shadows. Immediately, a massive man in a dark tailored suit stepped out from near the kitchen entrance. It was the restaurant's head of security. The massive man walked directly over to our former booth and stood right behind Tyler, crossing his thick, muscular arms. He was a silent physical threat, a very clear message that Tyler and Harper were not leaving that building until the debt was completely settled. I could see Tyler frantically talking, his hands waving wildly in the air as he tried to negotiate a way out of the trap. He was likely offering to leave his useless driver's license or promising to return tomorrow morning with a cashier's check. Gabriel just slowly shook his head, rejecting every desperate offer. Then Gabriel raised his hand and pointed a long finger directly at Tyler's left wrist. Even from my spot on the sidewalk, I knew exactly what Gabriel was demanding as collateral. It was a solid gold luxury watch. I had personally purchased that magnificent timepiece for Tyler on his 30th birthday. It cost over $8,000. I gave it to him as a symbolic gift, a reminder that he needed to start using his time wisely to build a real solid future for himself. Instead, the watch had become just another flashy accessory for him to show off at expensive country clubs. Through the thick glass, I watched my son slowly reach over with a completely defeated, trembling hand and unbuckle the heavy gold clasp. He slid the beautiful watch off his wrist. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring down at it, knowing that he was handing over his absolute last shred of dignity and fake wealth. Then he placed it gently on the white tablecloth right next to the broken, jagged pieces of his titanium corporate card. Gabriel picked up the heavy watch, inspected it briefly in the light, and gave a sharp nod. He slipped the watch into his pocket and gestured toward the front door, indicating that they were finally free to leave the premises. I watched them slowly stand up from the table. Harper looked completely destroyed. Her posture was severely hunched, and she kept her eyes glued to the floor, refusing to look at the people staring at her. But as Tyler turned toward the glass doors, his eyes suddenly met mine through the window. He did not look broken or humbled by the experience. He looked absolutely venomous. His jaw was clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might shatter, and his fists were balled tightly at his sides. The absolute humiliation of handing over his watch to a manager had not taught him a single lesson in humility. It had only ignited a massive, dangerous fire of pure hatred deep inside him. His arrogance was simply too deep to ever accept defeat gracefully. I knew right then, as I watched him march aggressively toward the exit, that this was not the end of the war. He was already plotting his revenge in his head, completely unaware that I had a massive legal and financial guillotine waiting to drop on his neck on Monday morning. The heavy doors of my luxury sedan closed, shutting out the cool night air, and the humiliating public scene we had just left behind on the sidewalk. I started the engine and pulled smoothly away from the valet stand, leaving my son and his wife to deal with the restaurant's security team. The interior of the car was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the tires rolling over the asphalt. For the first 10 minutes of the drive, neither of us spoke a single word. I navigated through the busy downtown streets, heading toward the quiet sanctuary of our suburban neighborhood. The ambient lights of the city flashed across the windshield, illuminating the dark cabin of the vehicle. Then the emotional dam finally broke. Diane buried her face in her hands and began to weep. It was not a loud, dramatic cry meant to seek attention. It was the deep, quiet sobbing of a woman whose heart had just been physically crushed into pieces. She cried for the little boy she used to read to at night. She cried for the years she had spent defending him to me when his grades slipped or when he acted out. She cried for the absolute disrespect she had just endured on a day specifically meant to celebrate her maternal love. I kept my hands firmly on the leather steering wheel, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. I did not reach over to pat her shoulder. I did not offer her empty platitudes or tell her that everything was going to be all right, because nothing was all right. Empty comfort is entirely useless in the face of complete betrayal. I let her cry because she needed to process the shock and mourn the death of the son she thought she had raised. But I also knew that her sorrow was about to be replaced by something much more powerful and permanent. I turned the steering wheel and pulled the car off the main road, parking in a quiet, scenic overlook that faced the glittering skyline of the city below. I put the car in park and turned off the engine. The sudden silence made Diane's quiet sobs feel even heavier in the confined space. I unbuckled my seatbelt and turned to face my wife. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, her makeup slightly smeared from the tears. She asked me in a broken, trembling voice where we went wrong, and how our only child could become so incredibly cruel and thoughtless. I looked deep into her eyes and told her that we did not go wrong. I told her that Tyler made his own conscious choices, and that the disrespect she saw at the restaurant was only the tip of a very dark and highly illegal iceberg. I reached into the back seat and pulled my heavy leather briefcase over the center console, setting it on my lap. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my digital tablet. I told Diane that I did not cut off their corporate credit cards tonight just because Harper insulted her at dinner. I explained that the horrible dinner was simply the absolute final straw, the final confirmation I needed that they were beyond saving. I told her that my patience had run out long before tonight, and that I had hired an independent forensic accountant to dig into every single transaction Tyler had made over the last 12 months. I unlocked the tablet and opened the heavily encrypted financial dossier my wealth manager had sent me. The screen illuminated the dark cabin of the car, casting a pale blue light over our faces. I handed the tablet to Diane. I asked her to look closely at the document displayed on the screen. It was a scanned copy of a loan authorization form from her personal retirement portfolio. When Diane was working double shifts as a registered nurse early in our marriage, she had set up a separate retirement account. It was her own personal safety net, built entirely with her own blood, sweat, and tears. It was money she had earned entirely on her own long before my heavy machinery business became a massive financial success. I pointed to the bottom of the digital document. I asked her if she recognized the signature on the authorization line. Diane squinted at the screen, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She traced the digital ink with her trembling finger. She told me that it looked exactly like her signature, but she swore she had never signed any documents regarding that specific account in over a decade. I took a deep breath and delivered the crushing truth that would change our family forever. I told her she did not sign it. I told her that her son forged her signature. I watched Diane's face as the reality of my words slowly sank into her mind. I explained the exact sequence of events the forensic accountant had uncovered. 2 months ago, Tyler desperately needed a massive injection of cash. He had already maxed out the hidden limits on the corporate cards, and he knew my financial team would immediately flag a direct withdrawal of that size from the company accounts. So he bypassed my security entirely and went after the softest target he could find. He went directly after his own mother. He used old tax documents he had saved from helping us organize our files last year to perfectly replicate her signature. He submitted the forged paperwork electronically to her brokerage firm and successfully secured a loan of $50,000 directly against her personal retirement funds. Diane was completely speechless. Her breathing became shallow as she stared at the $50,000 figure highlighted in bright yellow on the digital screen. She asked me in a barely audible whisper what he possibly needed that much money for. She asked if his software company was in some kind of massive legal trouble or if he owed money to dangerous people. I shook my head slowly. I swiped the screen to the next page of the dossier. It was a certified receipt from an imported luxury car dealership located downtown. I told her he did not use the stolen money to save his fake business or pay off debts. He used her hard-earned nursing money to pay the massive cash deposit on a brand new luxury Mercedes for Harper. The silence in the car became absolute. The sound of Diane's quiet weeping stopped completely. The tears rolling down her cheeks seemed to dry instantly in the cold air of the car's climate control system. I watched a physical and psychological transformation take place right in front of my eyes. The hunched, defeated posture of a heartbroken mother slowly straightened. The woman who had spent 34 years giving Tyler the benefit of the doubt completely vanished into the night. In her place sat a woman who had just realized she had been aggressively robbed by the very person she had sacrificed everything to protect. She stared at the receipt for the luxury car. She thought about Harper pulling up to our driveway last week, showing off the expensive leather interior of that exact vehicle and acting as if she and Tyler had earned it through hard work. Harper had been driving around town flaunting a massive status symbol paid for entirely with Diane's stolen retirement funds. Diane slowly handed the tablet back to me. Her hands were no longer trembling. Her face was completely smooth, completely devoid of the sorrow and pain that had consumed her just moments before. Her eyes, which had been soft and weeping, were now as hard and cold as shattered glass. She looked out the windshield at the distant city lights. She did not ask me why Tyler did it. She did not try to justify his actions or blame Harper for manipulating him into doing it. A forged signature is a deliberate, calculated criminal act that requires planning and pure malice. It was an act of absolute financial violence against his own mother. Diane turned her head and looked directly at me. Her voice was incredibly steady and completely unrecognizable. It lacked any trace of maternal warmth or forgiveness. She asked me what my next move was. She did not ask me if we could fix him or send him to therapy. She did not ask me if we should sit him down for a serious family meeting to discuss his mistakes. She asked me for the battle plan. I felt a surge of immense respect and pride for my wife. I told her about the mortgage default I had authorized with Warren while standing in the restaurant restroom. I told her about the corporate locks being changed on his office doors first thing Monday morning. I told her that by tomorrow afternoon, they would have absolutely no money, no business, and nowhere to live. Diane listened to every detail with cold, calculating precision. She nodded her head slowly, approving of the total financial destruction I had initiated. Then she looked at the tablet resting on my lap and told me that the financial ruin was simply not enough. She stated clearly that Tyler had committed a felony against her personal property and that she would not allow him to walk away unpunished. She told me to call the police the exact moment we returned to the house to file a formal fraud report. The maternal bond had completely snapped. She was no longer a victim seeking comfort in the passenger seat of my car. She was now my most ruthless ally, fully prepared to burn their entire fake world to the ground. Monday morning arrived with a cold, gray, overcast sky that perfectly matched my clinical mindset. I was awake long before the sun came up, sitting in the dark of my home office, reviewing the final legal documents my legal team had prepared over the weekend. I drank my black coffee and left the house at 6, leaving Diane to sleep peacefully in our bed. She had exhausted her tears the night before, and now she was resting while I went to war. I drove my vehicle down to the commercial real estate district of the city, listening to the morning news on the radio. Among my many corporate holdings, I own a sleek glass and steel office building right in the heart of the tech sector. 3 years ago, I had leased the entire 4th floor of this premium building to Tyler for his supposed software startup. I gave him a ridiculously low rent rate just to help him get his business off the ground. Today, I was taking my property back and shutting down his adult playground for good. I parked my car in the underground garage and took the private, secure elevator directly up to the 4th floor. When the polished metal doors slid open, I stepped into what Tyler arrogantly called his corporate headquarters. It was a massive open-concept space with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city skyline. It was meticulously designed to look like a billion-dollar tech company, but it was entirely empty of actual productive work. There were expensive imported espresso machines, ping-pong tables, and ergonomic leather chairs that cost thousands of dollars each. There was even a fully stocked custom bar in the corner. Everything in that room was paid for entirely by the sweat of my brow and the success of my holding company. I did not come to the building alone this morning. Warren, my lead attorney, was already there waiting for me in the lobby. He was standing next to a sharply dressed man holding a heavy clipboard who introduced himself as the independent financial auditor. Standing quietly behind them were 4 large men wearing dark tactical clothing. They were my private corporate security team brought in to ensure the transition was absolute and without incident. I gave a simple nod to the head of security, and they immediately went to work. The massive men began systematically moving through the pristine office space. They unplugged the top-of-the-line computer monitors and placed them gently into heavy-duty plastic moving crates. They gathered the expensive laptops, the massive server racks, the digital whiteboards, and every single piece of electronic equipment that my corporate money had purchased. The auditor walked closely alongside them, meticulously documenting every single serial number on his clipboard to ensure a perfect legal chain of custody. We were conducting a legally binding corporate asset seizure. This was not a disappointed father taking away his son's toys out of spite. This was a chief executive officer ruthlessly reclaiming stolen corporate property from an embezzler. Warren stood by the main glass entrance holding a thick manila folder containing the finalized eviction documents. We waited in complete silence, listening only to the sound of packing tape ripping from the dispensers as the digital clock on the wall slowly ticked closer to 8 in the morning. Right at 8 o'clock, the elevator down the hall chimed. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, completely out of sight. Through the thick, reinforced glass doors, I watched my son step out of the elevator. He looked absolutely terrible. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled, and there were dark, exhausted circles under his eyes. He clearly had not slept well after the humiliating disaster at the restaurant on Sunday night. He had probably spent the entire weekend arguing with his wife and trying desperately to figure out how to pay their massive personal bills. But as he walked toward his office doors, he tried to put on his usual mask of unearned arrogance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his electronic key fob. He pressed it confidently against the digital security reader mounted on the wall, fully expecting the doors to glide open. Normally, the card reader would flash a bright green light, and the heavy magnetic locks would disengage with a satisfying click. But this morning, the security reader emitted a harsh buzzing sound. A solid red light flashed across the digital screen, indicating that his access was strictly denied. Tyler stopped dead in his tracks. He frowned, staring at the small black device as if it had personally insulted him. He swiped his plastic fob against the reader again. The same harsh buzz echoed loudly in the empty hallway. The red light flashed again. He tried a third time, his movements becoming fast and erratic. When the red light flashed for the third time, his initial confusion immediately morphed into rising panic. He grabbed the thick metal handle of the glass door and pulled backward as hard as he could. The door did not even budge a single millimeter. The industrial magnetic lock held perfectly firm. That was when Tyler finally cupped his hands to the glass and looked through the window to see what was happening inside his supposedly secure kingdom. He saw the 4 massive security guards placing his expensive computers into the plastic bins. He saw the financial auditor checking off items on a long list. He saw his entire fake empire being dismantled piece by piece right before his very eyes. He began to pound his fists aggressively against the reinforced glass. He shouted loudly, demanding that someone open the door right that second. His voice was muffled through the thick pain, but I could hear the absolute raw desperation in his tone. He slammed his open palms against the glass, leaving sweaty handprints on the pristine surface. He honestly thought this was some kind of terrible mistake or a massive banking misunderstanding. He had absolutely no idea that I was standing just a few feet away, watching his entire fake world collapse into dust. I slowly stepped out from the shadows and walked toward the glass entrance. When Tyler saw me approaching, his eyes went incredibly wide. For a brief second, his shoulders dropped, and he looked intensely relieved, probably thinking I was there to save his business from being repossessed by the bank. I raised my hand and gestured to the head security guard. The guard walked over, typed a 12-digit master code into the keypad, and the heavy glass door clicked open. Tyler immediately tried to push his way inside the office, but the massive guard stepped forward, blocking his path with his wide, muscular chest. Tyler was forced to stand out in the public hallway, looking at me across the threshold of his own office. I walked forward until I was standing just a few inches away from him. Warren stepped up right beside me, holding the thick manila folder ready to execute his legal duties. I did not greet him. I looked him directly in his bloodshot eyes and handed him the thick stack of legal papers. I kept my voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any parental warmth. I told him that the paperwork in his hand was a formal and binding eviction notice. Tyler stared at the papers, his mouth hanging open in complete shock. He stammered frantically, asking me what I was doing and demanding to know why my security team was taking his things. He tried to argue that he had a signed commercial lease and that I could not just lock him out without a 30-day warning. I looked over at Warren, who simply adjusted his silk tie and watched the pathetic spectacle with absolute professional indifference. I turned my attention back to my son and delivered the crushing legal reality of his entirely ruined situation. I informed him that he had indeed signed a commercial lease, but he clearly had never bothered to read the fine print contained in the addendums. I explained calmly that his lease was entirely contingent on his perfect financial standing with my primary holding company. I told him that the exact moment the bank flagged his titanium corporate credit card for severe fraud and unauthorized use, he was automatically placed into immediate default across all related contracts. His status as a commercial tenant was permanently and legally revoked the second. Gabriel, the restaurant manager, cut his credit card in half on Sunday night. Tyler started to hyperventilate. He pointed frantically at the security guards packing the crates and screamed that they were stealing his proprietary software and his personal office equipment. I shook my head slowly, rejecting his delusion. I corrected him, stating firmly that the holding company had purchased every single computer monitor every laptop and every desk in that entire room. The equipment belonged entirely to the company, and we were simply recovering our stolen corporate assets. In less than 60 seconds, Tyler went from being a proud, arrogant tech executive to a man standing in a public hallway with absolutely nothing to his name. His entire source of income, his daily routine, and his carefully crafted public image were completely annihilated with a few strokes of a pen. He realized with crushing clarity that he could not even log into a computer to check his emails because he did not own a computer. He was entirely locked out of his own life. He looked down at the eviction notice, trembling violently, as the reality of his absolute poverty finally sank in. He had no money, no office, and no way to generate any legal income. But the absolute worst part of his nightmare was yet to come, and we both knew it. I looked at his terrified, pale face and knew exactly what was running through his panicked mind. He was thinking about his greedy, highly demanding wife. Harper was sitting in their massive suburban house right at that very moment, expecting him to fix their financial problems and secure their luxury lifestyle. She had absolutely no idea that her husband was currently standing in a hallway holding a worthless piece of paper completely stripped of his power and his wealth. And Tyler knew with absolute terrifying certainty that when Harper finally found out the truth, she was going to tear him to shreds. Tyler stood in the hallway for a long time after I handed him the eviction notice. When he finally walked out of that commercial building, he was a completely hollow shell of a man. He dragged himself to his car and began the long, humiliating drive back to his massive suburban home. I knew exactly what was waiting for him at the end of that drive. Harper was at home enjoying her usual Monday morning routine. She was likely lounging in her expensive silk robe, sipping gourmet coffee and browsing online catalogs for more designer furniture she could not afford. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the financial foundation of her life had just been entirely eradicated. When Tyler walked through the front door, he did not have to say a single word for her to know that something was catastrophically wrong. He collapsed onto the expensive Italian leather sofa and buried his face in his hands. He confessed everything. He told her about the severed corporate card at the restaurant. He told her about the security guards packing up his office. He told her about the eviction notice and the stark, terrifying reality that they literally had zero income and absolutely no access to any of my corporate funds. A normal wife, a woman with a shred of decency or moral character, would have been horrified by her husband's massive financial fraud. She would have demanded to know why he had been lying to his father for 3 years. But Harper was not a normal wife. She was a deeply entitled parasite. Instead of turning her anger toward Tyler for his deception, her twisted mind immediately sought out a target she believed she could easily control. She completely ignored the fact that Tyler had committed embezzlement. In her mind, I was the villain. I was the cruel tyrant who was unjustly starving them of their rightful inheritance. But she also knew that she could never intimidate me. I was a brick wall she could not break. So she aimed her venom at the person she had always viewed as the weakest link in our family structure. She aimed directly at my wife. Harper honestly believed that Diane was still the soft, weeping woman she had insulted at the restaurant the night before. She believed that Diane's maternal love for Tyler was a massive, glaring weakness that could be endlessly exploited. Harper figured that if she could apply enough emotional pressure, Diane would eventually crack. She assumed Diane would beg me to reinstate the credit cards and open the office doors just to keep the peace. What Harper did not know was that Diane had spent her entire Monday morning sitting in a cold, sterile room at the local police precinct. Diane had spent hours sitting across from a financial crimes detective, handing over the forensic audit and signing a formal sworn statement regarding the $50,000 forged loan against her retirement account. Diane had already crossed the emotional Rubicon. She was no longer a grieving mother seeking reconciliation. She was a woman seeking absolute, unrelenting justice. Diane had just returned home and poured herself a cup of tea when her cell phone rang. She looked at the screen and saw Harper's name flashing brightly. Diane told me later that she did not feel a single drop of anxiety when she saw that name. She felt a profound sense of calm. She answered the phone and simply listened. Harper did not say hello. She did not ask how Diane was feeling after the horrible dinner. She immediately launched into a vicious, calculated psychological attack. Harper raised her voice, making sure she sounded incredibly angry and completely righteous. She told Diane that my actions at the office that morning were completely unforgivable and abusive. She demanded that Diane intervene immediately to stop my supposed rampage. And then Harper deployed what she thought was her ultimate weapon. She used the one threat she believed would absolutely break a mother's heart. Harper lowered her voice into a cold, venomous hiss. She told Diane that if she allowed me to continue this financial cutoff, she would completely isolate us from their family. She stated very clearly that Diane would never be allowed to see Tyler again. She went even further, twisting the knife as deep as she could. She told Diane that if she let me take away their business and their money, she would never ever be allowed to see any of her future grandchildren. Harper promised that she would erase us from their lives completely, and that Diane would die an old, lonely woman who never got to hold her son's children. For 3 years, Harper had used the vague promise of future grandchildren as a dangling carrot to keep Diane compliant. It was a sick, emotional game she played to maintain dominance. She waited on the other end of the line, fully expecting to hear Diane break down into hysterics. She expected Diane to start sobbing, pleading for forgiveness, promising to talk some sense into me and offering to pay their bills to keep the family together. Instead, the line was completely silent for several long seconds. Diane took a slow sip of her tea. She looked around our quiet, peaceful home. She thought about the forged signature on her retirement documents. She thought about the brand new Mercedes sitting in Harper's driveway paid for with stolen blood money. When Diane finally spoke, her voice was so cold and so steady that it practically froze the air in the room. She did not shed a single tear. She did not offer a single apology. She completely shattered Harper's illusion of control with just a few sentences. Diane told her daughter-in-law that it was actually a very good thing she would never see those hypothetical children. She stated with absolute crystal clarity that she would never want her precious grandchildren to be raised by a deeply entitled parasite and a desperate common thief. Harper gasped loudly on the other end of the phone. The sheer shock of hearing Diane, the woman she had abused and belittled for years, speak to her with such absolute ruthless authority completely paralyzed her. She stammered, trying to regain the upper hand, trying to yell over Diane, but Diane simply spoke louder, completely dominating the conversation. Diane did not give Harper any room to breathe. She decided it was time to drop the absolute final anvil on their crumbling world. She told Harper that she should probably start packing a bag instead of making empty threats over the phone. Diane casually informed her that the formal police report regarding the forged $50,000 signature on her retirement portfolio had been officially filed with the Financial Crimes Division just an hour ago. She told Harper that the detectives were extremely interested in the paper trail that led directly to the luxury car dealership where her brand new vehicle was purchased. Before Harper could even process the terrifying reality of a pending felony investigation, Diane simply pulled the phone away from her ear and pressed the red button, disconnecting the call. She did not wait for a response. She did not want to hear another word from that woman ever again. She placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter and went back to drinking her tea completely unbothered. Back at their massive suburban house, the dial tone echoed loudly in Harper's ear. The phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the hardwood floor. The color entirely drained from her face as the full, terrifying picture finally came into view. This was not a simple family argument about a dinner bill. This was not a temporary financial timeout that they could manipulate their way out of. Her husband was not just broke. Her husband was about to be arrested for a massive federal crime against his own mother. The endless flow of corporate money was gone. The fancy downtown office was gone. And now the police were actively building a criminal case against them. Harper looked over at Tyler, who was still sitting on the sofa, staring blankly at the wall like a dead man. The realization hit her like a speeding freight train. Her emotional manipulation was completely dead. She had absolutely no leverage left, and no one to rescue her. If they did not do something drastic immediately, they were both going to end up in a federal courtroom facing serious prison time. Desperation is a very dangerous emotion, especially for arrogant people who have never had to fight their own battles. Her sheer panic quickly morphed into a frantic, highly aggressive survival instinct. She marched over to Tyler, grabbed him by his expensive shirt collar, and dragged him to his feet. She told him that they could not just sit there and wait to be arrested by the financial detectives. She convinced him that they had to strike back immediately to secure their freedom. They needed to create a massive public distraction to tie my company up in court and force a lucrative financial settlement before the criminal fraud charges could permanently destroy them. She decided right then and there that they were going to go on the absolute offensive, completely unaware that they were about to walk blindly into the most devastating legal trap I had ever built. Tyler and Harper were completely out of options and entirely out of money. With their corporate cards destroyed and their personal credit maxed out, they could not afford to hire a reputable legal defense team. They were forced to scrape the absolute bottom of the legal barrel. They found a sleazy contingency lawyer who operated his practice out of a dingy strip mall office next to a discount grocery store. This was the kind of attorney who advertised his services on late-night television and plastered his face on cheap highway billboards. He was an ambulance chaser who filed frivolous lawsuits hoping to intimidate wealthy targets into quick out-of-court settlements. Tyler, my son, who had spent the last 3 years pretending to be a billionaire tech mogul, was forced to sit in a stained waiting room next to petty criminals and desperate scam artists. The lawyer saw Tyler's last name and immediately envisioned a massive unearned payday. He did not bother to request the actual financial documents or ask any hard questions about why my company had forcefully locked Tyler out of his office. He simply listened to Harper's twisted version of reality and began eagerly drafting legal papers. They decided their best strategy was to go on the absolute offensive and create a massive public spectacle. They honestly believed that if they made enough noise and threatened my pristine corporate reputation, I would quietly open my checkbook and pay them millions just to make the embarrassment go away. On Wednesday afternoon, my lead counsel Warren walked calmly into my executive office, carrying a remarkably thick stack of freshly filed court documents. Tyler and his strip mall attorney had officially filed a massive civil lawsuit against me, Diane, and Vanguard Heavy Machinery. I sat behind my heavy oak desk, took out my reading glasses, and carefully read through their ridiculous claims. They were suing my holding company for wrongful termination, formally claiming that Tyler was a legitimate salaried employee who was fired without just cause. They also claimed a severe breach of verbal contract, arguing that I had supposedly promised Tyler a permanent executive partnership in the firm and unlimited lifetime access to our corporate credit lines. It was a complete and utter work of fiction. They even added a claim for severe emotional distress, demanding millions of dollars in punitive damages. But the absolute most arrogant part of the massive lawsuit was their formal request for an emergency legal injunction. They were actually petitioning a local civil judge to completely freeze all of my corporate business assets and force me to reinstate Tyler's fake salary and credit cards while the lawsuit was actively pending. They wanted to hold my entire heavy machinery empire hostage, so Harper could continue buying designer handbags and eating imported oysters. Filing a frivolous civil lawsuit was just the first phase of their desperate survival strategy. By Thursday morning, they had taken their campaign of vicious lies directly to the local press. I turned on the flat-screen television mounted in my office and watched the morning news broadcast with total emotional detachment. There was my son standing on the concrete steps of the county courthouse. He was wearing an ill-fitting, wrinkled suit and looking intentionally disheveled to perfectly play the part of the abused victim. Harper stood right next to him, acting like a completely different person. She had completely dropped her arrogant, demanding persona and transformed herself into a tragic, weeping wife. She wiped fake tears from her perfectly powdered face and leaned her head on his shoulder. They gave an exclusive primetime interview to a local reporter spinning a complex web of absolute lies. Tyler looked directly into the camera lens, and painted me as a tyrannical, emotionally abusive father. He claimed that I was a ruthless, greedy billionaire who was intentionally starving his own son out of pure malice and professional jealousy. He boldly told the reporter that he had built a revolutionary software company from scratch through his own hard work, and that I had aggressively stolen it from him the very moment it became highly profitable. Harper chimed in softly, claiming that my financial cruelty had completely destroyed their marriage and ruined their mental health. They played the victim card with absolute shameless perfection, creating a classic narrative of a poor, struggling son fighting against a massive evil corporation. The public media spectacle had an immediate and highly measurable impact on my business operations. In the modern corporate world, public perception is incredibly fragile and highly volatile. Within hours of the news broadcast airing on local television and spreading like wildfire across social media platforms, the stock price of Vanguard Heavy Machinery took a noticeable and sharp dip. The financial markets absolutely hate family drama and unpredictable corporate leadership. My private office phone began to ring incessantly. Panicked board members, nervous investors, and key stakeholders were calling my private line demanding to know exactly what was going on. They were deeply concerned about the public relations nightmare and the potential damage to our brand identity. I had to call an emergency meeting in the main executive boardroom to address the rising panic. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table watching the sweat form on the foreheads of my top executives. One of my oldest board members sounded completely terrified, openly suggesting that we should just offer Tyler a quiet multi-million-dollar cash settlement to make the news story disappear. The board members were terrified that the emergency injunction might actually be granted by a sympathetic liberal judge. If the courts froze our assets, it would completely halt our international shipping operations, delay our ASIV vendor payments, and potentially bankrupt the entire holding company. Tyler was successfully using the public panic to turn my own corporate board of directors against me. I listened to their panicked suggestions for a full hour before I finally held up my hand to silence the room. I looked at the terrified executives and told them that panic is the enemy of profit. I assured them that no settlement would be offered and no money would be paid to extortionists. I dismissed the board members and walked back to my private office with Warren. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out the massive windows, watching the city move far below me. I did not feel a single drop of fear, anxiety, or regret. I did not call my public relations team to issue a weak defensive statement. I did not call Tyler to negotiate a cowardly surrender. I simply smiled. Tyler honestly believed that he had backed me into a corner. He thought that the threat of bad press and dipping stock prices would force me to fold and give him everything he wanted. He fundamentally misunderstood the type of man he was dealing with and the immense power I wielded. He thought he was playing a simple game of public sympathy and emotional blackmail. He did not realize that he had just walked directly onto a legal battlefield where I make all the rules and control all the ammunition. The civil lawsuit he filed was completely based on blatant lies and formal perjury. By formally filing those documents in a court of law and making those specific claims, he had officially crossed the line from a simple family dispute into a massive legal war. More importantly, his lawsuit completely opened him up to the legal process of discovery. He had given Warren and me the exact legal framework we needed to legally subpoena his private records and completely expose his federal embezzlement in front of a sitting judge. Tyler thought the lawsuit was his ultimate weapon, but it was actually the very rope he would use to hang himself. The local news cycle was having an absolute field day with the false lawsuit Tyler had filed against me. My corporate public relations department was in a state of absolute panic, begging me to issue a formal press release to defend my character. I refused their request entirely. I do not fight my battles in the fragile court of public opinion. I fight in the cold, hard reality of financial ledgers and binding legal contracts. Tyler wanted to play the wounded victim on television, hoping to force me into a quiet, multi-million-dollar settlement. He thought I would be paralyzed by the bad press and the whispering of my corporate board members. He completely forgot that a titan of industry does not care about the bleating of sheep. I decided to respond to his public media spectacle with a massive private financial strike. I was not going to argue with him on the local news. I was going to take the very roof from over his arrogant head. 2 years ago, Tyler and Harper decided they needed a massive upgrade to their living situation to properly reflect their fake success. They scoured the local real estate market and found a stunning $1.2 million estate located in an exclusive gated community. The property featured a sweeping circular driveway, a custom infinity pool, and a neighborhood association filled with the local elite. Naturally, the traditional mortgage lenders took one look at Tyler's entirely fabricated software startup and his lack of verifiable income, and they laughed him right out of their offices. Diane had begged me to help them secure the home, so my private equity firm legally purchased the property in cash and underwrote a private strict mortgage directly to my son. For the first few months, he actually made the monthly payments using the platinum corporate credit card I had foolishly provided him. When I discovered that specific practice and put a stop to it, he simply stopped paying his mortgage altogether. For 24 consecutive months, I deferred his massive payments, completely absorbing the financial loss myself, because I did not want my only son to face the humiliation of foreclosure. I had been quietly shielding him from the severe consequences of his own financial incompetence. That protective shield was now completely gone. I sat in my quiet executive office and called Warren on his secure line. I told my lead attorney to pull the original mortgage contract from the corporate vault. I instructed him to formally execute the acceleration clause immediately. In the ruthless world of real estate finance, an acceleration clause is an absolute lethal weapon. It means that because the borrower has severely defaulted, the lender is no longer asking for the missed monthly payments to catch up. The lender is legally demanding the entire principal balance of the loan to be paid in full right this very second. Since Tyler did not have $1.2 million sitting in a checking account, the acceleration clause instantly triggered a fast-track commercial foreclosure. I told Warren I wanted the legal papers served to them by noon. I did not want them sent quietly through the certified mail. I wanted a private process server to hand the documents directly to Harper in broad daylight. Harper was completely unaware of the legal avalanche rushing toward her pristine, manicured lawn. Despite the fact that her husband was locked out of his office and all of their credit cards were severed, she was still desperately trying to maintain her illusion of high society dominance. That very morning, she was hosting an extravagant brunch for the elite women of her local country club. She had the entire event professionally catered, using the very last remaining funds from the stolen retirement money she and Tyler had taken from Diane. There were crystal pitchers filled with expensive mimosas, imported French pastries, and massive fresh floral arrangements decorating her sprawling marble kitchen island. She had invited these wealthy gossiping women over specifically to control the narrative regarding the lawsuit. She was parading around her massive living room, playing the part of the brave, tragic wife. She was telling her wealthy friends horrible, calculated lies about me, claiming that I was an abusive tyrant trying to ruin her beautiful marriage out of pure spite and jealousy. Right as Harper was pouring another glass of champagne and soaking up the fake sympathy of her gullible guests, a dark, unmarked sedan pulled up to her sprawling driveway. A tall man stepped out, wearing a sharp gray suit and holding a thick, heavy legal envelope. He walked right past the manicured hedges and the luxury vehicles parked out front. He marched straight up to the massive custom double front doors and rang the heavy brass doorbell. Inside the house, the loud chime echoed through the grand foyer, interrupting Harper's theatrical performance. She smiled brightly at her guests, assuming it was simply another delivery of expensive sympathy flowers, or perhaps a neighbor coming to offer their support. She walked casually to the front door, holding her crystal champagne flute in one hand, completely unprepared for the brutal reality standing on her front porch. She pulled the heavy wooden door open, expecting to be greeted with pity and admiration. Instead, the man in the gray suit looked at her with complete professional indifference. He asked her to confirm her legal name. Harper raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, slightly annoyed by his cold tone, but she proudly stated her full name, assuming he was a courier delivering a massive financial settlement offer from my terrified legal team. The man did not smile. He simply extended his arm and handed her the thick, heavy envelope. He stated clearly and loudly that she was officially served. Then he turned around and walked briskly back down the driveway, without looking back a single time. Harper stood in the open doorway, completely confused. Her wealthy friends had gathered behind her in the grand foyer, their curiosity highly piqued by the strange, blunt interaction. They were whispering among themselves, wondering what kind of dramatic legal document had just been delivered to their brave, suffering friend. Harper closed the front door and set her expensive champagne glass down on a decorative side table. She ripped open the thick envelope right there in the foyer, with her captive audience of country club gossips watching her every single move. She pulled out the heavy stack of legal papers bearing the official embossed seal of the county court. She fully expected to see a desperate plea for a settlement or a formal retraction of the corporate lockout. Instead, the very first word printed in massive, bold, black letters at the top of the page was foreclosure. Her eyes darted frantically across the dense legal text, trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the financial strike. The document meticulously outlined every single missed payment over the last 2 years, exposing the absolute lie of their wealth to anyone who cared to look over her shoulder. It stated clearly that Vanguard Real Estate Holdings was legally seizing the property due to extreme and prolonged financial default. The blood completely drained from Harper's face, leaving her looking like a ghost. Her hands began to shake so violently that the thick stack of legal papers slipped from her grip and scattered all over the polished hardwood floor. Her wealthy friends stepped forward, looking down at the legal documents spread across the ground. In elite social circles, financial ruin is a highly contagious and deeply shameful disease. As the women read the bold words detailing the massive default and the immediate seizure of the property, the entire atmosphere in the room completely shifted. The fake sympathy they had been offering evaporated instantly. These women realized they were not standing in the home of a wealthy peer who was being bullied by a mean father. They were standing in a stolen house hosted by a completely broke fraudster who could not even afford her own mortgage. The women began making rapid, awkward excuses. They put down their expensive drinks, grabbed their designer handbags, and rushed out the front door, completely abandoning Harper to her sudden nightmare. Harper dropped to her knees on the cold, hardwood floor, surrounded by the scattered pages of her absolute ruin. She picked up the final page of the summary document, which outlined the exact timeline of the property seizure. I did not give them the standard 30 days. I did not give them any leniency or grace period because of the massive fraud Tyler had committed against my wife. The legal order signed by a highly unsympathetic judge explicitly stated that they had exactly 14 days to completely vacate the premises. If they remained on the property on the 15th day, the county sheriff's department was fully authorized to arrive, throw their belongings onto the curb, and physically remove them from the estate. The massive house, the custom pool, the designer kitchen, everything was completely gone. Harper stared at the number 14 printed clearly on the page, feeling the walls of the mansion closing in on her throat. They had no money to rent an apartment, no credit cards to book a hotel, and absolutely nowhere to go. They were officially facing absolute total homelessness. The county courthouse was a massive, imposing structure built from solid gray stone and thick glass. It was the kind of building designed specifically to make a person feel incredibly small and entirely insignificant. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors of the main entrance, accompanied only by my lead counsel, Warren. I wore a dark, tailored charcoal suit and a perfectly knotted silk tie. I felt absolutely no anxiety as my leather shoes echoed against the polished marble floors of the main lobby. We bypassed the crowds of anxious people and took the private elevator up to the 4th floor where the civil injunction hearings were held. When we pushed open the swinging wooden gate to enter the designated courtroom, I immediately spotted my son and his wife sitting at the plaintiff's table. Tyler and Harper had arrived early to secure their territory. Despite the fact that Harper had just been served with a total property foreclosure notice 48 hours prior, she was doing her absolute best to project an aura of total confidence. She was wearing a high-end designer dress, and her hair was perfectly styled. Tyler was sitting next to her wearing a sharp navy suit, leaning back in his wooden chair, with a highly arrogant and smug expression plastered across his face. Sitting beside them was the cheap contingency lawyer they had hired from the strip mall. The lawyer was busy organizing messy stacks of paper, looking incredibly eager and overly confident. They all turned to look at me as I walked down the center aisle and took my seat at the defense table. Tyler actually let out a quiet, arrogant scoff and shook his head. He honestly believed that he held all the winning cards. He thought the massive media attention, the dipping stock prices, and the looming threat of this emergency legal injunction had finally broken my resolve. He expected me to walk into that room with a heavy checkbook, completely ready to surrender and beg for a quiet, confidential settlement. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and the bailiff instructed everyone in the room to rise. Honorable Judge Harmon stepped up to the bench. He was a stern, older man with silver hair and a very low tolerance for courtroom theatrics. He adjusted his dark robes, sat down in his high leather chair, and looked down at the docket with a deeply annoyed expression. Civil injunctions between wealthy family members were usually tedious, petty arguments over trust funds and vacation homes. The judge clearly expected a highly emotional and entirely ridiculous shouting match. He took off his reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and instructed the plaintiff's attorney to present his argument for the emergency injunction. Tyler's cheap lawyer practically leaped out of his chair. He walked to the center podium and immediately launched into a highly dramatic and entirely rehearsed performance. He did not present hard legal facts. Instead, he presented a sob story. He spoke loudly about the local news coverage painting Tyler as a brilliant young entrepreneur who had been maliciously locked out of his own successful software company by a jealous and tyrannical father. The lawyer formally requested that the judge immediately freeze all of the Vanguard Heavy Machinery corporate accounts. He demanded that the court force me to unlock the commercial office doors, reinstate Tyler's executive salary, and return all the confiscated computer equipment until a full civil trial could be scheduled. The lawyer spoke for 10 solid minutes, waving his hands and acting as if a massive human rights violation had just occurred. When he finally finished his dramatic speech, he returned to his seat, looking incredibly proud of himself. Tyler leaned over and whispered something into Harper's ear, making her smile a cruel little smirk. They both looked across the aisle at me, waiting for the inevitable white flag. They fully expected Warren to stand up, ask the judge for a brief private recess, and offer them millions of dollars in a desperate attempt to protect my corporate empire from being completely frozen by the court. Warren did not ask for a recess. He did not look nervous, and he did not scramble to organize his legal defense. He simply stood up from his chair, holding a single, thick, black binder in his right hand. He walked calmly to the center podium, completely ignoring the smug looks coming from the plaintiff's table. He addressed Judge Harmon with a calm, flat, and incredibly authoritative voice. Warren did not begin by defending my character against the vicious media lies. He did not even bother to argue against the ridiculous wrongful termination claims, because Tyler was never actually an employee to begin with. Warren decided to bypass their entire civil argument and go purely on the absolute offensive. Warren informed the court that the plaintiff was not a victim of wrongful termination, but a tenant who had defaulted on a commercial lease due to severe financial fraud. He stated that the emergency injunction request was nothing more than a desperate legal smokescreen designed to distract the court from a massive string of highly illegal activities. The cheap lawyer at the plaintiff's table immediately jumped to his feet, shouting an objection and claiming that Warren was making baseless, slanderous accusations. Judge Harmon completely ignored the cheap lawyer and instructed Warren to continue. Warren opened the heavy black binder and pulled out 3 identical copies of a deeply damning document. He handed one copy to the bailiff to deliver to the judge and politely offered another copy to Tyler's lawyer. Warren then detailed the exact nature of the $50,000 loan. He spoke clearly and deliberately, outlining how Tyler had secretly accessed his own mother's personal retirement portfolio. Warren explicitly stated for the official court record that the plaintiff had meticulously forged Diane Abbott's signature to illegally secure those funds. He explained that a formal felony fraud report had already been filed with the city police department and that a criminal investigation was currently highly active. The smug, confident smirk on Tyler's face completely vanished. The color drained from his cheeks so fast, he looked as though he might pass out right there in the wooden chair. Harper's cruel little smile collapsed into a mask of pure terror. Their cheap contingency lawyer stared down at the forged document in his hands, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He had taken this civil case on a contingency fee, hoping for a quick, easy payout. He had absolutely no idea that his clients had committed federal wire fraud and identity theft against their own family. But Warren was not finished. He turned the page in his binder and presented the second wave of total destruction. He submitted the certified forensic accounting audit of the Vanguard Heavy Machinery corporate credit accounts. Warren did not just show the judge the massive balances. He traced the exact digital path of the embezzled money. He read aloud the specific wire transfers that moved thousands of dollars from my heavy machinery holding company directly into the bank accounts of high-end luxury jewelry boutiques. Warren presented the verified receipts, proving that the corporate funds Tyler claimed he needed to save his software startup were actually used to purchase diamond necklaces, expensive watches, and imported designer clothing for his wife. The atmosphere inside the courtroom completely shifted. The air felt incredibly heavy and painfully cold. Tyler's lawyer slowly sank back into his chair, completely abandoning his dramatic posture. He pushed the documents away from him on the table, physically distancing himself from the toxic criminal liability sitting right next to him. He realized in that exact moment that he was not representing a brilliant, abused tech CEO. He was representing a desperate, unhinged embezzler who was about to go to federal prison. I sat perfectly still at the defense table watching the reaction of the man sitting high up on the wooden bench. Judge Harmon stopped looking bored. He slowly picked up his reading glasses and slid them back onto his face. He picked up the forensic audit and the forged retirement documents, holding them close to his eyes. He read through the highlighted sections detailing the massive theft and the forged signatures. The initial annoyance that had been present on his face at the beginning of the hearing completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a look of deep, serious alarm. He lowered the documents and looked directly across the room at Tyler. The judge was no longer looking at a frustrated son involved in a petty civil dispute over a trust fund. He was looking at a man who had committed massive financial crimes and then possessed the sheer blinding arrogance to walk into a court of law and demand more money. The trap I had carefully laid was completely sprung, and there was absolutely no escape from the legal slaughter that was about to follow. The courtroom was entirely silent, except for the crisp sound of heavy paper turning. Judge Harmon sat high upon his wooden bench, completely absorbed in the black binder Warren had handed him. Every single second that ticked by felt like a grueling hour. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded, resting comfortably on the defense table. I did not blink and I did not look away. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the man sitting across the wide aisle. Tyler was practically vibrating with nervous energy. The arrogant posture he had carried into the room just 20 minutes prior was completely gone. He kept swallowing hard, his throat working nervously against the collar of his expensive tailored shirt. He was watching the judge with wide, terrified eyes, desperately trying to read the facial expressions of the older man who suddenly held his entire future in his hands. Harper sat frozen right beside him, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into the wooden edge of the plaintiff's table. She was no longer looking at me with that cruel, confident little smirk. She was staring blankly at the floor, taking shallow, rapid breaths as the crushing reality of her impending doom finally began to compress her chest. Judge Harmon spent 10 excruciating minutes reading through the certified financial documents. He meticulously examined the highlighted wire transfers and the clearly forged signature on my wife's personal retirement portfolio. He cross-referenced the dates of the massive unauthorized corporate withdrawals with the verified receipts from the luxury car dealership and the high-end downtown jewelry boutiques. He was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the strict interpretation of the law, and he possessed an absolute zero-tolerance policy for blatant perjury in his courtroom. When he finally reached the very last page of the forensic audit, he did not speak a word immediately. He slowly lowered his reading glasses, letting them hang from the thin black cord around his neck. He carefully closed the thick black binder and placed his hands flat on top of the dark cover. He looked out over this quiet courtroom, and the ambient air grew so incredibly heavy that it was genuinely hard to breathe. The mild annoyance he had displayed at the beginning of the emergency hearing had completely transformed into a cold, furious judicial authority. He reached out with his right hand and picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He did not tap it lightly to politely call the room to order. He raised it high into the air and brought it down against the wooden-sounding block with a massive cracking impact that echoed like a gunshot through the high-vaulted ceilings of the room. Tyler physically flinched backward in his wooden chair, jumping wildly at the sudden violent noise. Harper let out a quiet, high-pitched, startled gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. Judge Harmon looked directly down at the cheap contingency lawyer, who was sitting completely paralyzed next to my son. The judge spoke with a booming voice that commanded absolute terrifying respect. He announced that he had thoroughly reviewed the plaintiff's formal request for an emergency injunction against Vanguard Heavy Machinery. He stated clearly for the official court record that the civil lawsuit filed by the plaintiff was not only completely devoid of any actual legal merit, but was an egregious and highly insulting abuse of the judicial system. Judge Harmon declared loudly that the civil lawsuit was officially dismissed with prejudice. For those unfamiliar with the strict rules of the law, a dismissal with prejudice is the ultimate judicial death sentence. It means the case is permanently closed, completely thrown out of court, and Tyler is legally barred from ever filing those ridiculous claims against my company ever again. His massive media-fueled public relations stunt was officially dead on arrival. But the judge was absolutely not finished. The frivolous civil matter was officially resolved, but the dark criminal matter had just been exposed to the absolute worst possible audience. Judge Harmon shifted his intense gaze away from the terrified strip mall attorney and focused his cold, furious eyes directly onto my son. He addressed him by his full legal name, his voice ringing with absolute finality through the quiet room. He told Tyler that he had walked into this courtroom demanding massive financial compensation under the absolute false pretense of being a wrongfully terminated employee. The judge leaned forward, resting his forearms on the high wooden bench, staring directly down into Tyler's terrified soul. He told my son that he was not a victim of wrongful termination or a victim of a breach of verbal contract. He stated with absolute unwavering legal clarity that the documents contained in the black binder proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Tyler was a perpetrator of massive federal wire fraud and severe identity theft. The words hung suspended in the cold, conditioned air of the courtroom. Wire fraud, identity theft. These were not casual terms used in petty family squabbles over trust funds or vacation homes. These were heavy federal felony charges that carried mandatory minimum prison sentences. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, hoping to offer some kind of pathetic excuse or lie his way out of the corner, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just let out a quiet, choked gasp, shaking his head back and forth in complete, desperate denial. Judge Harmon did not care about his silent panic. He sat up straight and delivered the final crushing blow to their fake empire. The judge announced that as a sworn officer of the court, he was legally and morally obligated to report the blatant commission of a major financial felony. He stated that he would not be returning the black binder to Warren. Instead, he was officially seizing the documents as critical evidence. He looked right at Tyler and told him that he was personally forwarding the entire forensic audit and the forged retirement documents directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the district attorney. He instructed the court clerk sitting below him to make the immediate criminal referral right there on the spot. The sheer gravity of that statement hit the plaintiff's table like a massive concrete block dropped from a great height. The cheap contingency lawyer had heard absolutely enough. He had taken this case entirely on contingency, hoping for a quick, multi-million-dollar civil settlement to pay off his own mounting debts. He expected to send a few angry letters and sit through a quiet, profitable mediation. He had absolutely zero intention of stepping into the direct line of fire of a massive federal fraud investigation. A lawyer can quickly lose his license to practice law and face prison time himself if he knowingly represents a client who is actively committing perjury and financial crimes in front of a sitting judge. Absolute survival instinct took over completely. The sleazy lawyer did not ask the judge for permission to be formally excused. He did not offer Tyler a single word of legal counsel or try to defend his client from the massive accusations. He immediately stood up from his chair and began wildly shoving his messy stacks of paper into his cheap leather briefcase. His hands were shaking so fast that several loose pages slipped from his grasp and scattered across the polished floor, but he did not even bother to bend down and pick them up. Tyler looked over at him, his eyes incredibly wide with absolute horror. He reached out and grabbed the lawyer's sleeve frantically, whispering and begging him not to leave them alone in the room. The lawyer aggressively yanked his arm away from Tyler's grip, as if my son were infected with a highly contagious, deadly disease. He looked down at Tyler with a mixture of pure, unfiltered disgust and absolute terror. He loudly declared right in front of the judge that he was officially withdrawing as legal counsel effective immediately. He stated firmly that he would absolutely not touch a federal fraud case and that he completely refused to be associated with blatant perjury. He snapped the brass locks of his briefcase shut, turned his back on Tyler and Harper, and practically sprinted down the center aisle of the courtroom, pushing his weight through the heavy wooden double doors and disappearing into the lobby forever. I sat quietly at the defense table watching the entire spectacular collapse unfold. Warren simply sat next to me, calmly making a brief, meticulous note on his yellow legal pad. The power dynamic in the large room had shifted so violently that it left Tyler and Harper completely stranded on an isolated island of their own making. They were sitting completely alone at a massive wooden table surrounded by empty chairs and scattered papers. Their frivolous civil dispute, their arrogant attempt to publicly humiliate me and hold my heavy machinery company hostage had just backfired in the most catastrophic way mathematically imaginable. They had walked into that county courthouse hoping to secure a massive unearned payday. Instead, they had just walked blindly into a total criminal nightmare. The legal trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force, and the district attorney was now actively coming for their absolute freedom. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Tyler and Harper. Warren and I followed at a deliberate, measured pace. I wanted to witness the immediate aftermath of the legal explosion I had just detonated. The wide marble corridor of the county courthouse was bustling with lawyers, clerks, and citizens. But as my son and his wife stepped out into the open space, they might as well have been standing on a deserted island. The absolute silence between them was deafening. The grand theatrical performance they had put on for the local news cameras just yesterday was completely dead. There was no more tragic wife leaning on her brave entrepreneur husband. There were only two desperate parasites realizing that the host body had just turned highly toxic. Tyler stopped walking near a large marble pillar. He leaned heavily against the cold stone, looking as if all the bones in his legs had suddenly dissolved. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his expensive suit. He reached out a trembling hand toward Harper, seeking some kind of physical comfort or emotional reassurance. A loyal spouse would have grabbed his hand. A decent partner would have told him that they would hire a real criminal defense attorney and fight the charges together. But Harper was not a partner. She was an opportunistic predator, and she had just realized that her primary source of unearned wealth was about to be locked inside a federal penitentiary. Harper did not take his hand. Instead, She physically recoiled from him as if he were covered in venom. She took 3 rapid steps backward, putting physical distance between herself and the man she had sworn to love for better or for worse. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The polished high society mask completely melted away, revealing the vicious feral creature hiding underneath. She looked at Tyler not with pity, but with absolute aggressive disgust. She started yelling right there in the middle of the crowded public hallway. She did not care about the other lawyers turning their heads to watch. She did not care about the security guards standing near the metal detectors. She pointed her manicured finger directly at Tyler's face and unleashed a torrent of absolute venom. She screamed that he had lied to her from the very beginning. She yelled that he had promised her limitless wealth and told her that the corporate accounts were completely his to control. She reminded him loudly of his arrogant claims that the family trust was entirely bulletproof and that his father could never touch them. Tyler held his hands up in a weak, pathetic attempt to calm her down. He begged her to lower her voice, frantically whispering that people were staring and that they needed to go home to formulate a plan. But the word home triggered an entirely new wave of fury inside her. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. She screamed, asking him what home he was talking about. She brutally reminded him that a process server had just handed her a foreclosure notice in front of her entire country club social circle. She yelled that they had no home, they had no money, and now because of his unbelievable stupidity, they were facing a federal criminal investigation. She completely dismantled his manhood right there in front of dozens of strangers. She told him he was a pathetic, weak little boy pretending to be a titan of industry. She stated clearly that she had only married him because she thought he was the heir to a massive, heavy machinery empire. She openly admitted that she never respected his fake software company and that she only cared about the platinum credit card in his wallet. Now that the card was destroyed and the police were coming, she had absolutely zero use for him. She was fiercely protecting her own survival. She knew that if she stayed tied to him, the district attorney would eventually look into her own spending habits and potentially charge her as an accomplice to the massive embezzlement. Tyler tried to reach for her again, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. He begged her not to abandon him. He pleaded with her, telling her that he loved her, and that he did all of this just to give her the luxury lifestyle she deserved. He tried to use his massive crimes as proof of his absolute devotion. It was the most pathetic display of weakness I had ever witnessed. Harper was completely unmoved by his tears. She looked at him with eyes as cold and dead as frozen earth. She reached down to her left hand. She grabbed the massive diamond engagement ring and the platinum wedding band that Tyler had purchased using my stolen corporate funds. She yanked the expensive rings off her finger with such violent force that it left a red mark on her skin. She did not gently hand them back to him. She pulled her arm back and threw the heavy jewelry directly at his chest. The rings hit his suit jacket and clattered onto the hard marble floor, bouncing and rolling away toward the wall. Harper did not even watch them fall. She stood tall, her chest heaving, and delivered her final absolute judgment. She declared in a voice loud enough for the entire corridor to hear that she was officially filing for divorce the second she left the building. She told him that she would testify against him in federal court if the district attorney offered her absolute immunity. She promised that she would throw him under the bus to save herself without a single second of hesitation. She turned on her expensive designer heels and stormed down the hallway. Her footsteps clicked sharply against the marble, echoing like a countdown to his absolute ruin. She pushed through the heavy glass exit doors and disappeared into the busy city streets, completely abandoning the sinking ship she had helped destroy. Tyler did not chase after her. He just stood there, completely frozen, staring blankly at the spot where his wife had just been standing. He slowly lowered his gaze to the polished floor, watching the diamond ring sparkle under the harsh fluorescent lights. He did not bend down to pick it up. He knew that the jewelry was completely useless now. He could not sell it, because it was purchased with stolen funds, and it would immediately be seized as criminal evidence. I stood a few yards away, observing the entire collapse with Warren standing silently beside me. I watched my son realizing the sheer totality of his destruction. In the span of less than 72 hours, he had lost absolutely everything. He had lost his fake software business and the downtown office that gave him his arrogant identity. He had lost the $1 million suburban estate and the luxury vehicles that masked his complete incompetence. He had lost the highly demanding wife who had driven him to commit federal crimes in the first place. He had lost every single shred of his public dignity and his personal pride. He was standing in a public courthouse, completely bankrupt, entirely alone, and completely exposed. There was no corporate safety net to catch him, and no maternal love to shield him from the severe consequences of his actions. He was a man drowning in an ocean of his own making, and the massive weight of a federal criminal indictment was already pulling him down into the dark abyss. He slowly lifted his head and looked down the hallway, his eyes finally meeting mine. He saw me standing there watching his absolute ruin with total clinical detachment. He finally understood that he had nowhere left to turn. The false reality he had lived in for 3 years was completely dead, and the true terrifying nightmare was just beginning. That evening, a massive storm rolled into the valley, dropping sheets of freezing rain across the city. The wind howled against the reinforced glass windows of my private study, but inside the temperature was perfectly regulated and warm. I was sitting in my leather armchair holding a glass of aged bourbon and watching the flames dance in the stone fireplace. It had been an incredibly long and highly productive day. The legal machinery I had set into motion was now operating entirely on its own, crushing the last remaining fragments of my son's fake empire. I did not feel exhausted. I felt an immense sense of peace settling over the house. The cancer had been aggressively removed from our family, and the healing process could finally begin. Then, right around midnight, the silent alarm on my security console flashed bright blue. The perimeter sensors indicated that someone was standing at the main heavy iron gate right at the edge of my sprawling property. I set my crystal glass down on the wooden side table and walked over to the bank of high-definition security monitors mounted on the wall. I tapped the digital screen to enlarge the camera feed from the front gate. The infrared night vision clearly illuminated a lone figure standing in the pouring rain. It was Tyler. He did not have a vehicle. He must have taken a city bus as far as the public routes would allow, and walked the remaining miles up the steep, winding roads to our exclusive neighborhood. He looked absolutely pathetic. The expensive designer suit he had proudly worn to the county courthouse that morning was completely soaked, clinging heavily to his frame like a wet garbage bag. His hair was plastered flat against his forehead, and he was shivering violently in the freezing wind. He looked exactly like a stray dog begging for shelter, but I knew with absolute certainty that he was a vicious predator who had simply lost his teeth. The heavy oak door of my study opened softly, and Diane walked into the room. She was wearing her thick cashmere robe holding a warm mug of herbal tea. She walked up beside me and looked silently at the glowing security screens. She did not gasp, and she did not look away in horror. We stood shoulder to shoulder watching the man we had raised standing out in the middle of a torrential storm. Tyler reached out with a trembling hand and pressed the silver call button on the heavy brass intercom panel. The audio feed clicked open, filling my quiet, warm study with the loud static sound of the heavy rain and his erratic, shallow breathing. He did not know if we were awake or if we were even watching him through the cameras. He just started speaking blindly into the metal speaker grill, his voice cracking and entirely broken by pure, unfiltered desperation. He called out for me, sobbing so incredibly hard that he could barely form complete sentences. He told me that Harper had officially left him and that she had abandoned him on the street right outside the courthouse without a single dollar to his name. He confessed that his credit cards were entirely declined and he did not even have enough cash to buy a hot cup of coffee or rent a cheap motel room. He begged me to open the heavy iron gates and let him inside the secure estate. He pleaded with me, asking if he could just walk up the long driveway and go to sleep in his old childhood bedroom. He tried to invoke the deep nostalgia of his youth, hoping that the memory of him as an innocent little boy would somehow magically erase the massive federal crimes he had committed as a grown man. He promised that he would be incredibly quiet and that we would not even know he was living inside the house. When I did not immediately answer through the intercom, his desperate pleading escalated into highly frantic begging. He pressed his wet face close to the camera lens, tears streaming down his cheeks, mixing with the freezing rain. He begged me to call Warren and tell the lawyers to withdraw the criminal fraud report from the district attorney. He swore on his life that he would pay back every single penny of the $50,000 he stole from Diane's retirement account. He offered to do absolutely anything to avoid going to federal prison. He completely threw away his arrogant identity as a tech chief executive officer. He sobbed into the microphone saying he would put on a uniform and sweep the dirty concrete floors of my heavy machinery warehouses. He promised to work minimum wage to scrub the toilets, to do the absolute hardest manual labor available if I would just save him from the terrifying legal nightmare closing in around him. He told me he was entirely broken and ready to submit to my rules. I listened to his pathetic, empty promises with complete emotional detachment. A man who meticulously forged his own mother's signature and stole her future security cannot be trusted with a warehouse broom, let alone a second chance at freedom. The men who sweep my warehouse floors are honest, hardworking citizens who earn their living with dignity. Tyler was a common thief who simply got caught. I turned my head and looked at Diane. I needed to be absolutely sure that her resolve had not wavered at the sight of her only child crying in the freezing rain. Diane looked at the screen, watching Tyler beg for his life. Her expression remained completely smooth and entirely unmoved. The maternal bond had been completely severed the moment she saw the receipt for Harper's luxury vehicle. She took a slow sip of her hot tea, looked directly into my eyes, and gave me a single firm nod. She was giving me the absolute total permission to end the relationship forever. There would be no magical reconciliation, no tearful hugs in the grand foyer, and no forgiveness. I reached out and pressed my thumb firmly against the brass intercom button on my console. The small red light illuminated, indicating that my voice was now broadcasting through the speaker at the front gate. Out in the cold rain, Tyler immediately stopped sobbing the exact second he heard the electronic click. He stood up straight, looking directly up at the camera lens with wide, hopeful eyes. He honestly believed that his tears had finally broken my defenses. He thought I was about to type the security code to swing the heavy iron gates open and welcome him back into a life of absolute comfort. I kept my voice incredibly low, incredibly steady, and completely devoid of any parental warmth or pity. I spoke directly into the microphone, ensuring every single syllable carried the massive weight of absolute finality. I told him that on Sunday night, his arrogant wife had pointed her finger at my beautiful wife and demanded that we be put on a separate check. I reminded him of her exact hateful words. I repeated the sentence back to him slowly and deliberately. "You are not paying for her." I paused for 3 long seconds, letting those cruel, arrogant words echo through the speaker and wash over him in the freezing rain. I wanted him to remember the exact moment he chose to abandon his mother for a parasite. Then I delivered the ultimate, undeniable consequence of his actions. I told him that I am no longer paying for you. I did not wait for him to process the words. I did not wait for him to start screaming or begging again. I lifted my thumb off the button, completely cutting the audio feed from the house to the gate. I reached over and pressed the main power switch on the security console. The bright digital screens instantly went pitch black, completely erasing Tyler from our view. The silence rushed back into the warm study, returning our home to a state of absolute peace. Diane stepped closer, resting her head gently against my shoulder. We turned away from the blank monitors and walked slowly back toward the stone fireplace, leaving the cold rain and the broken man entirely behind us. The consequence was absolute, and the door to our lives was permanently sealed shut. Over the next 90 days, the immense weight of the federal justice system completely crushed my son. The criminal referral made by Judge Harmon was not just a passing threat. The district attorney assigned a team of highly aggressive financial fraud investigators to the case. They did not need to spend months building a complex timeline because Warren had already handed them a perfectly wrapped gift. The paper trail was absolute and undeniable. Within 3 weeks, Tyler was formally indicted by a grand jury on multiple felony counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. He spent one deeply humiliating night in a downtown holding cell before a public defender could arrange for his preliminary bail. His cheap civil lawyer was long gone, and since I had completely frozen his access to my wealth, he could not afford to hire a high-powered criminal defense attorney. He was forced to rely on an overworked public servant who looked at the mountain of forensic evidence and immediately told him that fighting the charges in front of a jury would guarantee him a 10-year prison sentence. Faced with the terrifying prospect of spending a decade behind bars, surrounded by hardened criminals, Tyler completely surrendered. He sat in a cold, fluorescent-lit interrogation room and signed a highly restrictive plea agreement. To avoid serving hard time in a federal penitentiary, he agreed to a massive period of strict supervised probation and accepted a binding court order requiring absolute full financial restitution. The plea deal meant he had to pay back every single penny he stole from his mother, plus the massive sums he embezzled from my heavy machinery holding company. The judge made it incredibly clear during his sentencing hearing that if he missed even one scheduled payment or violated any term of his strict probation, he would immediately be arrested and sent directly to prison. He traded his physical freedom for a massive lifetime of crushing insurmountable debt. He was now a convicted felon with a permanent criminal record that would instantly disqualify him from ever holding a meaningful corporate position for the rest of his natural life. With the criminal plea officially entered into the public record, the aggressive liquidation of his physical life began immediately. The banks swooped in like hungry vultures. Early one Tuesday morning, 2 massive heavy-duty tow trucks arrived at the driveway of the million-dollar estate. The repo men did not knock on the door or ask for permission. They simply hooked their heavy steel chains to the axles of the luxury Mercedes and the expensive sports car Tyler had leased. They dragged the highly expensive vehicles down the street and out of his life forever. A few days later, the 14-day eviction notice completely expired. The county sheriff's department arrived to finalize the foreclosure. They stood on the manicured lawn with their arms crossed, while a moving crew hastily boxed up the remaining cheap furniture and hauled it to a discount storage facility. The wealthy neighbors watched from their front porches, whispering among themselves, as the massive custom home was officially seized. The locks were permanently changed, and a large white bank-owned sign was hammered deep into the front grass. His entire kingdom was completely dismantled piece by exact piece. Harper did not stick around to watch the tow trucks take her precious cars or the sheriffs lock the front doors. The exact moment she realized the criminal charges were absolutely real, she packed her remaining designer clothes into several large suitcases and fled the property. She had proudly filed for divorce, hoping to distance herself from the massive scandal. But the damage to her public reputation was already completely fatal. The wealthy women from her exclusive country club, who had witnessed the process server deliver the foreclosure notice, spread the story of her absolute ruin faster than a raging wildfire. She was permanently blacklisted from every high society event, charity gala, and upscale restaurant in the city. Completely broke and socially radioactive, she was forced to move back into her childhood bedroom at her parents' modest home. Her parents, who had blindly believed her arrogant lies about our family for years, were deeply humiliated by the massive public scandal. She now spends her days entirely isolated, trapped in a small suburban bedroom, endlessly scrolling through social media. She is forced to watch her former friends enjoy the luxury life she permanently threw away due to her own greedy entitlement. She has absolutely zero access to the expensive spa days, the imported wines, and the high-end shopping sprees that used to define her entire personality. For Tyler, the reality of his new life was a brutal daily physical punishment. With a fresh felony conviction on his public record, no technology firm or corporate office would ever even grant him an interview. The man who had spent 3 years pretending to be a brilliant software executive was forced to accept a minimum wage job working the cash register and stocking heavy shelves at a local commercial hardware store. He now wears a cheap, scratchy uniform vest instead of tailored designer suits. He spends 8 exhausting hours a day standing on hard concrete floors loading bags of heavy fertilizer and stacks of rough lumber into the pickup trucks of local contractors. There is a deep poetic justice in watching a man who stole from a heavy machinery company being forced to perform grueling manual labor just to survive. At the end of his exhausting shifts, he takes a public bus across town to a cramped, dirty studio apartment located in a highly undesirable and unsafe neighborhood. The apartment is barely larger than the walk-in closet he used to have at the massive estate. The walls are paper-thin, the plumbing constantly leaks, and the tiny single window overlooks a noisy, busy intersection. He sleeps on a cheap mattress on the floor, completely surrounded by the suffocating reality of his own massive failures. But the absolute most painful part of his new existence comes every 2 weeks when his employer hands him his meager paper paycheck. Warren did not simply win the court cases and walk away to fight another battle. Warren is a man of relentless focus, and he executed the financial restitution order with maximum legal aggression. Before Tyler ever sees a single dollar of his hardware store earnings, Warren's legal office automatically garnishes the absolute maximum legal percentage straight from the corporate payroll department. Tyler opens his paper envelope, only to find that his already tiny minimum wage check has been brutally sliced down to practically nothing. Every single drop of his hard manual labor goes directly back into Diane's retirement portfolio. He works until his hands bleed and his muscles physically ache, just to slowly repay the massive $50,000 theft that bought his ex-wife a luxury car she does not even own anymore. He lives on a microscopic monthly budget, counting spare metal change just to afford cheap groceries and daily bus fare. He is trapped in a permanent financial prison of his own construction. The absolute arrogance that once defined his entire personality has been completely beaten out of him by the slow, merciless grinding wheels of the justice system. He has absolutely nothing left to his name except the crushing, heavy weight of absolute consequence. The weeks following the final legal proceedings brought a profound shift to our daily lives. People often assume that when you completely dismantle someone who has wronged you, you throw a massive party to celebrate their absolute ruin. But Diane and I did not pop champagne to cheer for the destruction of our son. There is no joy in watching the child you raised become a convicted felon forced to scrub floors just to survive. What we celebrated was not his misery, but our own profound freedom. For 3 long years, a thick, toxic fog of anxiety and emotional manipulation had choked the air inside our home. Every phone call used to be a veiled demand for money. Every family dinner used to be a calculated performance designed to extract more wealth from my corporate accounts. Now the house was incredibly quiet, but it was a warm, healing silence. The massive financial drain that had been bleeding my heavy machinery company dry was completely severed, and the deep emotional wounds were finally starting to close. The sprawling $1 million suburban estate was formally placed on the commercial real estate market immediately after the county sheriff finalized the eviction. Without Harper there to demand ridiculous custom renovations and throw extravagant, expensive parties, the pristine property sold incredibly fast to a lovely young family who actually possessed the legitimate income to afford it. The massive influx of cash from the property sale was deposited directly back into my primary holding company, completely wiping out the bad debt Tyler had accumulated. Furthermore, Warren's aggressive daily garnishment of my son's minimum wage paychecks was slowly but surely refilling the stolen retirement funds. Diane and I sat down in my quiet study one evening and had a very long discussion about the future of our wealth. We realized that simply hoarding the recovered money would serve absolutely no purpose. We wanted to build a lasting legacy that actively combated the very entitlement that had poisoned our family tree. So we took the recovered funds and established a massive permanent financial endowment. We named it the Diane Abbott Trade School Scholarship. Instead of giving free money to arrogant young adults who wanted to play pretend at being high-level technology executives, we directed our wealth toward the gritty blue-collar foundation of the city. We funded the education of young men and women who wanted to learn heavy diesel mechanics, advanced welding, and industrial construction. We personally interviewed the candidates, looking specifically for kids who had thick calluses on their hands, kids who worked exhausting night shifts to support their younger siblings, and kids who looked at their elders with genuine, unforced respect. When Diane handed the very first scholarship check to a young man who had grown up in the foster care system, the beautiful light completely returned to her eyes. She was finally nurturing a future that actually deserved to grow, and her maternal heart found a new, worthy purpose. With our financial legacy officially secured and our toxic burdens completely lifted, we decided to introduce a new kind of life into our quiet home. We drove to a local animal shelter located on the rugged outskirts of the city. We walked past rows of barking animals until Diane stopped in front of a chain-link enclosure holding a large, scruffy golden retriever. The shelter workers told us he was a rescue dog who had been callously abandoned by his previous wealthy owners the exact moment he became too expensive to feed and care for. He was roughly 4 years old, a little malnourished, but his dark eyes held an incredible amount of gentle intelligence and pure soul. We finalized the adoption papers that very afternoon and brought him home. We named him Barnaby. The contrast between Barnaby and our former family dynamic was deeply poetic and highly satisfying. We had spent years pouring millions of dollars into ungrateful humans who only demanded more luxury and showed absolute disrespect. Now we provided basic dry food, a warm, soft bed, and a little daily affection to a discarded animal, and in return we received absolute, unwavering loyalty. Barnaby followed Diane everywhere she went, resting his heavy golden head on her lap while she read books in the sunroom. He greeted me at the door every single evening with a wagging tail, never asking for a platinum credit card or a luxury vehicle. He brought a simple, uncomplicated joy back into our daily routine, completely washing away the bitter, lingering memories of the past 3 years. 6 months after the massive legal storm officially concluded, I decided it was time for a permanent change of scenery. I stepped away from the daily demanding operations of Vanguard Heavy Machinery, placing my most trusted, competent executives in charge of the holding company. I packed our bags, loaded Barnaby into the back of our luxury vehicle, and drove Diane down the scenic, beautiful coastline to Carmel, California. We purchased a stunning private beach house perched right on the edge of the rocky cliffs overlooking the vast blue Pacific Ocean. The salty ocean breeze and the rhythmic, soothing sound of the crashing waves provided the absolute perfect background for our entirely new chapter. Late one afternoon, Diane and I walked down the wooden stairs to the soft white sand. The sun was beginning to set, painting the endless sky in brilliant shades of burnt orange and deep purple. Barnaby was running happily along the shoreline, chasing the seagulls and splashing loudly in the shallow tide pools. I set up 2 comfortable canvas beach chairs and opened a vintage bottle of red wine I had saved specifically for a moment of total peace. I poured a generous glass for Diane and handed it to her, watching the warm, golden evening light catch her beautiful silver hair. She looked completely radiant, entirely free from the heavy sorrow that used to pull down her shoulders. I sat down in my own chair, holding my glass of wine, and took a deep, satisfying breath of the clean ocean air. Just as the bottom edge of the glowing sun touched the ocean horizon, the perfect silence was broken by a sudden mechanical noise. My cell phone, resting on the small wooden table between our chairs, began to vibrate and ring loudly. I slowly reached over and picked up the device, looking down at the bright digital screen. The caller identification displayed an unknown number, but the area code was instantly recognizable. It was the exact area code of the sprawling city we had left behind. The exact city where my son was currently scrubbing hardware store floors and living in a tiny, miserable apartment. It was undoubtedly him, calling from a borrowed phone or a dirty public payphone, desperately trying to reach through the absolute void I had created. He was likely calling to beg for mercy again, to ask for a small financial loan to buy groceries, or simply to hear the sound of his father's voice after months of total isolation. I held the vibrating phone in my hand, feeling the desperate mechanical pulse against my palm. A year ago, that sound would have triggered a massive wave of anxiety, obligation, and misplaced parental guilt. Today, it meant absolutely nothing to me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the urge to press the green button, to lecture him, or to offer him a single word of empty comfort. I did not even bother to press the red button to formally decline the call and let him know I was ignoring him. I simply looked at Diane, who was watching the beautiful sunset, with a serene, peaceful smile, completely unaware of the digital desperation happening right in my hand. I slowly lowered my arm, opened the heavy plastic lid of the insulated cooler sitting next to my chair, and casually tossed the ringing phone inside. I let the lid fall shut, instantly silencing the noise and burying the toxic past in the dark, freezing ice. I raised my glass of wine, clinked it gently against my wife's glass, and turned my attention back to the beautiful, crashing waves. The surgery to remove the parasite was a complete success. The patient had fully recovered. The silent adjustment was officially complete. The absolute greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blind parental generosity, without strict boundaries, does not create gratitude. It breeds entitlement. For years, Diane and I believed we were helping our son by shielding him from the harsh realities of the world and subsidizing his expensive lifestyle. In reality, we were actively financing our own disrespect and feeding a parasite. True love is not about giving endlessly to someone who only takes. True love requires the strength to say no and the absolute courage to let a toxic person face the devastating consequences of their own actions. If you have ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life to protect your own peace, share your experience in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute justice.